Turn, if you would, some very familiar passage of Scripture in the 6th chapter of the book of Ephesians. Paul's letter to the church at Ephesus. And what we're going to read this morning will be such familiar reading that you will recognize it. But I was challenged by it in my own spirit and soul just this week. And trying to find the will of the Lord, and one of those all too frequent times when nothing seemed to work. And so we're going to go to this old passage in Ephesians chapter 6. Verse 12, 13, and 14. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. Wherefore take unto you the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day. And having done all to stand, stand therefore, having your loins girt about with the truth, and having on the breastplate of righteousness. And you can go ahead and read the following scriptures where he gives the entirety of the whole armor of God. But I want us to extract a few words from verse 13 and a couple of words from verse 14. And Paul said to this church that was in a hotbed of sin and degradation, and no doubt were struggling in their spiritual experience. The Bible doesn't say, but I surmise that they no doubt looked around them and saw, since Ephesus was a very prospering city, and they saw the prosperity of all around them and the troubles that they were having for simply trying to live a life above reproach of sin. And Paul said to them in such stern tones, having done all to stand, stand therefore. Singer, songwriter, preacher, evangelist, pastor, whatever title he holds, Donnie McClurkin, a few years ago wrote a song, and he sings that song with such authority. I love it. I was going to try to sing it once, bought the track. It didn't work for me at all. But the song that he wrote sums up the position of probably most, if not everybody here this morning. Maybe some here exactly today. There have been in all of our lives situations arrive that it looked as if we weren't going to make it. That this was going to be the trial that would do us in. That this load was going to be so heavy that we would fall beneath it. We couldn't go on. And Mr. McClurkin wrote this song, and I would like to share, I can't sing it as I said, but I'd like to share some of the words that he penned, and hopefully they will strike home to somebody here this morning. He wrote this: what do you do when you've done all you can, and it seems like it's never enough? Anybody ever been there? What do you do when you've done all you can and it seems like it's never enough? What do you say when your friends turn away and you're left all alone? Tell me, what do you give when you've given your all and it seems like you can't make it through? Listen to what he said. Well, you just stand. When there's nothing left to do, you just stand. Watch the Lord see you through. Yes, after you've done all you can, you just stand. Having done all you can, stand. If ever any songwriter describes the mindset and the life experiences of any person who's trying in any manner to live as they should, this song certainly does it. In a day and age when the kingdom of God seems to be sometimes entirely opposite of what Jesus declared it should be, it's today. We live in a vicious world. You know that. You turn on the television, sometimes, if you're like me, you're hesitant to turn on the news because it's going to be bad. You know it's going to be bad. Several individuals shot, killed, trouble on every hand. We live in a vicious world. We live in a world where often it seems to be defined by the haves against the have-nots. And we expect this divided camp in a world whose basic tenet is out to destroy everybody that you can destroy. But I don't want you to leave me here now, but I want to say something that may seem like inappropriate in the pulpit. But sadly, that same type of attitude all too often is found among those who claim to be proponents of the kingdom of God. Someone much smarter than I said that we Christians are the only ones who try to kill our sick. Somebody gets in a little bit of trouble, and instead of loving them back to health, as the Scripture tells us we must do, if we're not careful, we see individuals putting their foot on their head and shoving them down a little bit farther. That's not standing for the truth, my friend. It's standing for something else. And so consequently, when troubles come, and they will come, the feelings of isolation and loneliness are magnified. Little sidebar, and this really has not a lot to do, I guess, with what I'm trying to preach this morning. I've been at this a long time. Sometimes longer than I'd like to think. But my thoughts on preaching have, in the past few weeks, taken a turn. Taken a turn on how I'm looking at preaching. I heard an old preacher, and I mentioned it before, older than me, I think. He looks it anyway, or looks older than I think I look. His name was Johnny James. He made a statement, and I've borrowed it and used it from this pulpit, but it has really just mesmerized me lately and speaks to me almost every day. He was preaching to an audience of preachers. And there were hundreds of them there. Pentecostal preachers like we are. And I looked over the audience, and there were those who had the holier-than-thou look. Now, they were mostly men, so they didn't have that piled-up hair, and but they had that hard, holy look about them. One of my best friends passed away a few years ago. He's preached here, and some of you will remember him. His name was David Fleetwood. Fleetwood was one of the best preachers I ever heard. He came out of an organization that was hard as flint. First time I ever knew anything of David Fleetwood, I saw a car. He was pastoring a church in an Illinois city not too far from here. And there was his picture, and he looked like he was mad as an old wet hen. I teased him about it all the time. But there were in this audience, and as the camera would pan across, you could tell that there was those that, they had all the attributes down, and they know when to lift their hands just right and stand up and back the preacher just right. But this old black man, when he began to preach, he began to put every one of them in their place. He defined what preaching was from a seminary point. Eschatology. Various points that is brought out if you go to seminary. They'll teach you. Danny knows some of this. He's the only one of us that ever went to school. And he said, I know what all of those things are about. I can do all of that. I know what it's about. But he looked at those preachers that were there and he said, I'm going to go against every rule of the seminary. He said, I'm going to tell you this, when you go home, you do this one thing and this one thing only. And that is preach. He said, preach. Preach, he said, preaching can do what nothing else can do. Now, before you think because I are one I'm bragging, I'm not. The Bible tells us by the foolishness of preaching that men are one. We live in a day and age when even preachers have seemed to get that attitude that we're just a cut above. No, we aren't a cut above. The only thing we are is a man or a woman, flesh and blood like everybody else, with a calling on our life. That's what you are. We're here because of the purpose of God. That statement that Johnny James made challenged me. I'll have a little free confession for you. We all too often we're placed in positions, whether by expectations of others or ourselves, where we find ourselves trying to one-up somebody. I've mentioned it before, and those who have been here as long as I've been pastor know that I made the statement I'd never have a fellowship meeting. I've been here a long time, and I've kept my word. Somebody said, you against fellowship? No, I'm for fellowship. But I've been in very few real fellowship meetings. I've been in a lot of preaching contest meetings, a lot of battleship meetings where one tried to one-up the other one. I didn't need that then or now. But we live in that day and age when it seems that you've got to be more eloquent. You've got to be more knowledgeable, and we need to study to show ourselves approved, workmen unto God that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. The Bible tells us that. But it is by the simplistic attitude of preaching, and that's not just from a pulpit, by the way. It's telling the world the simplistic truth of who He is, that Jesus came to seek and to save that which was lost. Yeah. I'm here to tell you this morning that God's not concerned about how eloquent we may be. He can make us as eloquent as He wants us to be. He used a donkey one time to preach. I don't think that donkey was probably the most eloquent preacher ever walked in a pulpit, but he got the job done. We need to have an attitude that God is going to move in our lives. We find ourselves, as I said, trying to one-up somebody, and the church takes on some devastating hits because of that. Now, as I said, this is a free confession, and I'm well aware that there are far better orators than I could ever be. But when I heard that old man say, go home and preach, I made a confession before God and a promise. Forever how many years I've got left, I want to do one thing. I want to grace this or any other pulpit with the calling of God just simply to preach. Our familiar text here in the 6th chapter of Ephesus emphasizes the supreme need of both the ministry and the laity. Having done all to stand, stand therefore. Or in Donnie McClurkin's words, just stand. We live in a world where a term that we used not to hear is utilized almost every facet of living. Makes no difference what your vocation may be. We hear this term. You might be a doctor or a lawyer or Indian chief. It don't make any difference. This term comes to fore in all of those vocations, and it also does in the preaching industry. Ever so often we hear this term, burned out. You just burned out. You got tired. Everything seemed to go wrong. Nothing seemed to go right. Got tired of battling and beating your head against the wall, and you said the easy thing to say, I know what I'll do. I don't have to put up with this. I'm going to quit. I have acquaintances, friends, who said that very same thing, and today they're not gracing any pulpit anywhere, even though the calling of God is upon their life. They burned out. They got to the point that standing became too difficult. And they lost sight of what Paul said to the church at Ephesus, when you've done all you can do to stand, simply stand. If ever there was a time, church, that we need to take our toes and not draw an imaginary line like some of our leaders do, but we need to draw that line in the stand and say, this is as far as I can go. You're not going to back me up any farther. I'm going to be right here till the rooster crows. We need those individual men and women and boys and girls who will have the bulldogged tenacity of a spirit that says, I am going to make it. With God on my side, come hell or high water, I am going to make it. God has equipped us, church. He's equipped us for that very thing, that in the midst of trouble and trial and distress and woe, and honey, we're there. If He'd asked me to do it, I'd have done it a little different. But He didn't ask me. If I'd designed it so once we come to know Him, it would really be easy street. Every person sitting here knows that ain't the way it is. It rains on the just and the unjust. It's not just the world that has trouble. It's the church as well. It's people like you and you and you and you and me who bat our heads against the wall, and I would almost, not supposed to bet, we're not supposed to bet anywhere, I guess, but especially behind the pulpit, that wouldn't be the best place to bet, would it? Started to say, well, I'll wager, but I guess that's the same thing.
Declare.
There you go. Thank you. I declare this morning that there is not an individual sitting under the sound of my voice who hasn't at one time or another in your Christian walk said this: I quit. Some of you know this story. I've used it, but it explains, when this fellow said just preach, it explains, I think, maybe why it hits me so hard. Several years ago, as some of you know, you were here and you weathered out the storm and stayed hitched up to the plow, and I appreciate that more than you ever know. We were going through a particular period in the church when every Sunday night, Sunday morning, you look out and there'd be somebody else that decided they was going to sample the grass, and somebody else the pastor. I'd come to church on Sunday night, and I've shared this before. I'd quit on Sunday night. I don't have to do this. I can make a living doing something else. I don't have to do this. I don't have to put up with this abuse. I don't have to do it. Danny Mahoney bought me a membership to the golf course at Cave and Rock, and I'd quit on Sunday night, get up on Monday morning, throw my golf clubs in the car, and drive to Cave and Rock. Probably for the run of a month. When I pulled up in that yard, there was one guy there. He didn't know a thing that I was going through. Not the first thing did he know. I never told him. I never asked him to ride with him. He'd always say, throw your clubs in my cart, play around with me. During the course of those holes of golf, somewhere along the course of that game, he would say these words to me: you're doing a good job. Don't let anybody tell you different. I'd leave the golf course. I'd think, maybe I can do this again. Well, come Wednesday night, I'd quit again. Thursday morning, I throw my clubs in the car. You can believe it or not, but for a month, every Monday morning and every Thursday morning, that same man would say, play this round with me. Having done all you can do to stand, stand. If there is a supreme calling upon the church, I think it would be simply the call to stand. To stand in the face of all adversity. To stand in the face of woe. To stand in the face of discouragement and even disagreement. To stand when the easy way would be to shut the book up and say, I'm putting you up on the top shelf and I ain't pulling you back. That's the easy thing. But God's not called quitters. I got one nod and one that's right. God didn't call quitters. Surely you can say amen. Well, one or two more. Let's try it once more. God didn't call quitters. Amen. Thank you. We live in a world where quitting's the easy thing. We quit everything. I grew up, as did some of you, there was a sense of loyalty in most things. My dad was a Chevrolet man for years. That's all he would drive. He wouldn't own another car. It was always a Chevrolet. There were some of you, probably your dad was Ford people. Wouldn't have anything else. Was there a lot of difference in them? Probably not. But they were loyal to the type of car. Not so anymore. Chris and I started out, I was a Chevrolet man. Now I got a rice burner sitting over there in the yard. We've lost that sense of loyalty. We find it in vocation. People get a job, they kept that job. Not anymore. Well, wish the wooden pulpit was back, I could hide a little easier. But we've lost, even matrimony, we've lost that loyalty. People get married with this thought, well, if it don't work, I can always get out of it. We've lost that sense of loyalty, of making it work against all odds, standing when it's not easy to stand, having done all you can do to stand. Now sometimes we lose sight of those words that he said, having done all you can do. Stand. It's not an easy thing to stand often. It's not an easy thing to stand for what's right. It's not an easy thing to stand for our conviction. We live in a world that's full of people that just have this idea or that idea or whatever moves them, whatever the Spirit moves them at a particular time, that's the way they are. We need those men and women who will stand for truth and who will establish the truth in their lives, in the lives of their families, in the lives of their children, so that this gospel truth would be propitiated to coming generations. The Bible tells us that were it not for the grace and mercy of God, the very elect would be lost. I look at that a little different than I did at one time. I looked at it like the elect was going to be those stalwart individuals that, brave. The enemy's very seldom destroyed the church by coming at them and just beating them up. The Bible even tells us what it does. It is the little foxes. The little foxes. The little foxes that spoil the vine. Stand therefore. It takes courage to stand. I admire those individuals. I might not agree with much of what they have to say, but I admire those individuals to a certain degree who get convicted on something and they're going to stand. If the whole world disagrees, they're going to stand for their conviction. something to be admired there. We've got too many Christians, to borrow an old Southern Illinois term, if they're anybody's dog, it'll hunt them. We need those individuals who stand for truth and righteousness and for what this book has to say. It's not easy. I'd like to preach to you that it's easy, but it's not. It is a difficult road. It's a path that's straight and narrow, and few there be that find it. When the opposite is a broad way that leads to destruction. It's not easy to stand, having done all to stand. I think about some of those old preachers. I was going through a list. I found it in my bookcase just recently. It was an address list that somebody had sent me in. And I began to go down through there, and I thought, this one's gone, this one's gone, this one's gone. And I looked and I thought, most of these guys are gone. Lets me know how old I'm getting. But I remembered some of those old preachers who stood in the face of adversity. One of the men who's responsible for this church being here, A.D. Van Hoos, one of the best preachers, best mentors I ever had. Brother Van Hoos would never take his coat off in the pulpit. And someone asked him one time, and he told me this story. Van, when it's hot, why don't you take your coat off? He couldn't. He had one white shirt. And it had been washed and laundered so many times that the fabric was rotten and the whole back of the white shirt was busted open. When they didn't know what tomorrow held, what adversity they were going to face, but they stood for the truth. I might add, look around at our world today and it's getting close to that again. We never know from one service to the next what's going to happen, what's going to take place. Oh, it can't happen here, I heard you say, don't bet on it. We live in a day when trouble is on every hand. But the call is still, having done all you can do to stand. Stand therefore. Why? Why is it so necessary to stand? The Bible tells us that as a church, we are set on a hill. We are like a city set on a hill whose light can't be hid. He uses another example. If you have a candle lit, would you put it under a bushel? No, you let your light shine. And he said, let your light so shine before men that they might see your good works and glorify the Father which is in heaven. Having done to stand. I don't know what you face this next week. I don't know what troubles are going to arise in your life or in mine. I'm not a seer or a fortune teller or a future teller. I'm none of that. This one thing I do know, that we can put in our spirit the will and desire to stand so greatly that no matter what comes or goes, when all the dust settles, we may be marred, we may be bruised, we may be sore, we may be battle scarred, but we're going to stand. Having done all you can do to stand, stand. I purposed that I was going to do my best to just preach. Let me share that where it'll fit most of you. Most of you don't have the call to preach, but it doesn't take away the call. You have one.
The greatest success of my preaching this morning would be that everyone sitting in this house would go forth from here with a renewed purpose. And we're going to stand in the face of adversity with the witness that Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forevermore. That He is God in every situation. In troubled times He's God, in good times He's God. He's God. And we're going to stand. Now, having said that, would you stand?